in some ways we've been sold a lie by the tech companies if they are saying that. But it requires, I think, more of a nuanced conversation we are currently having around this sort of stuff. And that is in part, I think, because we are letting the tech companies dictate that conversation ourselves. And so that naturally tends towards the kind of more utopian view where AI is going to solve all of our problems and create none along the way.
Chris Stokel-Walker, tech journalist. Thanks for joining me on the AI Report today.
Thanks for having me.
The consumer experience of AI chatbots has, I would argue, somewhat plateaued recently, with OpenAI's recent release of GPT-5 falling short of expectations, or at least of CEO Sam Altman's launch promises, at least. In response to the launch criticism, however, head of ChatGPT Nick Turley promised GPT-5 would feel smarter as of Saturday. There were some broken auto switcher problems, and they needed to tweak some of the determination boundaries between which clients would be used depending on which prompts. It's been a couple of days now. Has it improved at all, do you know?
I think that it is a little bit better. Of course, you did mention there some of the issues that they faced initially after release, where they had been banking on trying to simplify, I suppose, some of the model options that you had before the release of GPT-5. We basically had an alphabet soup of options for different models that were really impenetrable to the average user. So you could pick GPT-4, you could pick GPT 4.5, you could pick GPT 4.0, you could pick GPT 0.3 or O3, and all of these did different things and had different benefits. And people kind of picked their favorite child out of all of them. And then OpenAI basically said, we are going to try and simplify this an awful lot. We are going to give you two options if you are paying, but really only one for a non-paying user, which is you get GPT-5 and we are going to determine what happens. And of course, we saw those big issues. Now, they have been fixed a little bit. I think that there are still some holdouts who say, actually, I really liked the old album as it was. I preferred the traditional models. And so anything that is new and modern, I'm going to dislike. But in reality, I think this is pretty much the same performance as those older models. And yeah, they have fixed some of the issues, although maybe not quite matching up to the hype that they had said.
We'll definitely get onto some of the issues that are still present in a little bit, but according to OpenAI, GPT-5 can still hallucinate about 10% of the time. So how does that compare with the previous models you just listed, more than I can remember off the top of my head? And what does that figure really represent? Because I'm sure a lot of people at home who've used these sorts of tools will not recognize that it is wrong 1 out of 10 times or says something made up 1 out of 10 times.
Yeah, so the hallucination levels have decreased a little bit, probably around about half of what they were in terms of maybe something like 14, 15 to 20% for previous models, depending on which one you picked. And that is part of the problem. They all had their own personalities and their own little choices of how they did this stuff. I think the problem is that any hallucination level above zero is still a problem. Now, OpenAI and other AI companies that are tackling this problem basically say that actually this AI model makes things up, lies or misinterprets the information that it is given less frequently than a human would, and there is a reality behind this. Humans also make mistakes. We do misspeak and we do say things sometimes that are not true, either deliberately or accidentally. But the problem is that we're not kind of, using this model across millions of users with the assumption and all of the hype that comes with it that the computer must know best because it is a computer. And in reality, we have both, I suppose, the AI companies today to thank for that because they are often the biggest hype people behind their models themselves. But also, we do have to kind of blame sometimes the people who first identified artificial intelligence as artificial intelligence way back nearly 70 years ago now. That was almost the original sin of actually using the word intelligence here because it does give users a sort of false confidence in the outputs of these models, which can often be a little bit flawed.
Some users have, of course, taken it upon themselves to test the GPT-5 as they always do. Sort of, I think one that I read was getting them to list the number of states in the US which have the letter R in them, for example, and it would list it would say there would be 43 and give you a list of 22 with 4 of them not having any letters of R in them, or many things like that. Is this a fair sort of representative test of AI to sort of do these kind of things? Because this is something a child could do, which is obviously, you would expect something that has been poured money into and uses compute power and all these sorts of things would be able to do at least what a child's reading comprehension could do.
I think it depends on how you intend on using AI and the various tools that come from that. If you want it to kind of replace people's jobs in a very human-like way, then yes, that does matter enormously because it is the small things that can make the biggest difference here. If you can't correctly count the number of R's in a blueberry or identify, for instance, that 5.11 is less than 5.8, which is often one of those things that AI systems fall down on, then there are big issues here. But that is to try and equate artificial intelligence with human intelligence, and that is perhaps not the best way of doing it. The problem is that the way that these models are presented by these companies suggests that actually we should be equating one with the other. These are, ultimately fatal flaws that come down to the design of these models. Rather than looking at things in the form of words or numbers, instead they look at it through what's called tokens, and sometimes those tokens are basically chunking up the data that you put into an AI model for analysis to make it easier for that AI model to look at this. And those tokens can often be split down the middle of words, which means that they become very difficult to interpret. Now, I think, if we are considering the sort of mainstream use, then not being able to identify the number of R's in a letter or getting the US states wrong is something that really scuppers the belief in AI's prowess for the average user. And so either we have to, I suppose, try and better educate the average person who uses these models and might encounter them of what are the benefits and what are some of the issues with them, or we need those companies behind them to be a little bit more realistic about what they actually can do in their marketing. And I think probably we're going to be more likely to have the former than the latter.
I'll definitely want to get on to sort of the use cases and the viability in a little bit. But just first, OpenAI has said that they've, I think, quote, minimized the sycophancy or people pleasing that has been going on in previous models. And it's been a few days again. Has it been successful in cutting those sort of people pleasing tendencies?
Yeah, I think it's certainly a world away from the most outlandish version of this that we had several months ago. Earlier this year, of course, ChatGPT went haywire, almost just being too people pleasing in a way. And they have managed to reduce that somewhat. I think that there is still an element of these models are saying what they want you to say and what you want to hear, which is always a bit of an issue if you are trying to tackle issues of real life truth or fiction, and if you're maybe trying to have a difficult conversation with them. But I think that this is, decreasing somewhat. Certainly, a lot of the people who have been using these latest models in the aftermath of their release have been complaining actually about the fact that the personality has been shorn from these models in a way that they really miss, which suggests its own kind of interesting idea of how much we are going to become attached to these LLMs, these large language models, as they start to roll out into our lives.
Sort of beat me to my next point there, but do you think that some of the criticism leveled at GPT-5 is because of this sort of move away from this people-pleasing aspect? Is trying to sort of, I think Sam Altman has come out, not necessarily against, but said that using chatbots for things like therapy or being a confidant is not maybe the best use case for these sorts of things. And so do you think that shift away from sycophancy is behind some of the criticism?
Yeah, I think that there is a kind of rooted group of users who believe that actually they just want things to be as they were, and they got quite used to this model. It's worth bearing in mind actually the distance between the latest model release and the previous one is comparatively long compared to the previous one and the one before that, which means that we've had time to, I suppose, have the model bedded in to our day-to-day lives. And that is, I I think a thing that we need to be conscious of. But in reality, I do think that actually there were some pretty simple mistakes that were made by OpenAI in the release of GPT-5. Number one, of course, is just actually saying that this would be a world changer, when in reality, it is just an iterative development along the way. Now, there's a strong argument to be said that actually, if you are a kind of non-techie AI user, someone who dips in and out of this and is more casual than hardcore in terms of your use of these tools, and actually, this is a kind of significant leap in capabilities, because actually, what's happening is you are being shunted towards the correct model without having to pick the wrong one. Which means that potentially you unlock more opportunities in the queries that you do ask of it. But having said that, I do think that actually, the overall model and the kind of move towards being more user friendly is good for the average person, but perhaps for those who are the ones who shout the loudest and the ones who use these models perhaps the most, a little bit of a step back, because it takes away some of the agency that they had. And I think it's notable that actually, in response to that, OpenAI have been pretty quick to kind of wind back some of those changes and at least give those who do want the option of picking a specific model that ability to do so.
Would you say then that at least OpenAI's GPT-5, if not much of the concept of AI and the way it's been touted by many of the people making it, has been overstated, overestimated, sort of overplayed for whatever reason?
Yeah, well, in the week before we saw the release of GPT-5, we were seeing practically every single OpenAI employee posting on X and other social media that something big was coming. And I think the reality is that that wasn't what we got, at least those of us who are in and around this world regularly. I think that in part that is because of the way that they decided to try and design this new version. It was always going to be one that is prepared more for the casual user than it is for the kind of more committed user. But I think that there is a massive gap between the perception of what we thought was coming and the reality of what we thought was coming. And so, for an awful lot of people who are focused on AI and really interested in this sort of stuff, it was nothing if not a disappointment, which is, I think, why we've seen OpenAI reacting quite so quickly to these people, because often they are the ones that are paying the subscriptions for this. And we saw an awful lot of social media chatter in the immediate aftermath saying, well, actually, what am I paying for in this instance? I might as well just try something else or get rid of my paid subscription. And so I think this was the first moment that we really saw a quite concerted user backlash to an OpenAI release.
I think the benefits of AI in use cases like diagnosing or identifying tumours, things like that, are fairly well known, and these sorts of fields, or sort of creating another order to coding to simplify some of that, obviously still needing double checking and overcomplicating things often. But reliable is probably not a word people would still use to describe AI. Certainly, like you say, for those that are not using it in medical settings, but more sort of personally, professionally. Have some industries been too eager to implement it, as opposed to the question of it being overstated? Have some been too quick to take it on and absorb it into their workflows?
I think that there's been a requirement almost from most businesses who want to try and stay ahead of the competition to adopt some form of AI. And so that has been, I think, a real risk, where actually a lot of people have jumped and said, we need to roll AI into everything that we do without necessarily considering the ways that it might be best used within those specific organizations. There are ways that people can kind of sort this out if they are in decision-making positions of businesses. We have techniques like retrieval augmented generation, which is RAG, which allows you to try and iron out some of those idiosyncrasies, some of those kind of different responses to the same queries, depending on what side of the metaphorical bed the AI system that you're talking to got out of in the morning, designed to try and kind of, I suppose, get a level of consistency that we previously haven't had with these AI systems. But yes, I think there is a real fear amongst organizations, because ultimately the media, the tech companies themselves, and therefore the general conversation that is being had around AI is either get in or you'll end up missing out. And when you're talking about companies already operating in a very difficult economic situation, I think the fear is that if you don't try and adopt an AI system in some way, shape, or form, then your competitors will, and they might well leave you in the dust along the way.
So there's been one industry which has lent on AI a little bit, and arguably it was more misused than has been something that was flawed from the start. But it has, I think, also led to some job losses as a result, which was the law has used AI to, or some people practicing law rather, have used AI to write documents for them for submission to judges and various courts, and have found out that later that the legal precedent that the AI had cited was completely made up, essentially, or hallucinated. What other industries are there like this that we are maybe not quite aware of yet, that have these sort of weaknesses to, I suppose it's a lack of verification on one side, and also people being a little lazy perhaps on another?
I mean, there are a couple that immediately stand out. Maybe not necessarily industries, but particular areas because they are relatively unique in terms of not operating wholly as businesses. One is politics and government advisory. We have seen in the last week the Swedish Prime Minister relying on ChatGPT to try and sense check some of his policy decisions, which has been met with outrage by some within Sweden because those citizens are saying, well, we elected you as you. We wanted you to be the decision maker and to actually pick and choose what is important, not to outsource this to an AI. Now, the Prime Minister doubled down on that and said, actually, this is a useful tool. It is sensible for me to do so. And I think that it helps me make better decisions. It informs me in a way that I think benefits all of us. So I'm going to continue to do so. But the risk is that, as we see the UK government starting to integrate AI into lots of different areas, that small hallucinations or statistical biases in the training data that it is using for these sorts of decisions can suddenly amplify and snowball to become massive, quite societally shaping options for governments to pursue. So, you need to look at some of the criticism and some of the fears that civil liberties campaigners have around, for instance, facial recognition software and the risks there of misidentification, to see how this could affect and perhaps access to benefits, decisions on passports or immigration, things like that. The other, I think, is in medicine. We are seeing an awful lot of use here where it is actually very good. For instance, saving weary-eyed radiologists from trying to spot very small spots on X-rays of lungs and brains and things like that. AI is very good at that sort of pattern matching. I think where it's less good is when the doctor starts to cede control of decision making to an AI system. The reality is that these tools should always be used as co-pilots rather than going on autopilot. And I did a story recently for the British Medical Journal, and I've heard a lot of people talking about this in the months since, that actually they feel a little bit concerned when they go to a GP that automatically, their conversations are being transcribed by an AI and analyzed that way to try and inform the decision making. Now, there's, sometimes there can be a risk here if the AI mishears something, that it thinks that you have one illness when in fact you have another. And so I think we do need to be careful in those two sectors in particular that actually we're using this as a kind of beneficial tool rather than just as a wholesale replacement of human intuition as well.
Like you say, I think it kind of has been billed as this fix all, it'll do everything, nobody will ever have to work again sort of concept of taking responsibilities away from us, when arguably it's given us more, at least, verification responsibilities. Is this something that we will eventually be able to see with AI, where we can trust it? Sort of, will hallucination issues be a less than zero, well, less than one, a 0.1% chance of occurrence, and even then we would probably still have to verify?
Yeah, well, this is the really interesting question. You've kind of you've hit at it in your asking of it, which is at what point do we feel comfortable with a margin of error that is acceptable to us, and in what particular area? You can imagine that perhaps there is a difference if you are having a cancer diagnosis in your level of confidence in that decision versus I don't know, picking something for your evening meal tonight using AI. I think that we are getting there in terms of improving on tamping down on some of those hallucinations. We've already seen that in terms of the development between ChatGPT 4 or 4.5, whichever one you were using, in GPT-5, the latest release. So there is this kind of downward trend line towards getting rid of some of those hallucinations. The reality is no system is ever going to be perfect. And so I think that actually we're not ever going to get to that point where this is completely flawless. In some ways, we've been sold a lie by the tech companies if they are saying that. But it requires, I think, more of a nuanced conversation we are currently having around this sort of stuff. And that is in part, I think, because we are letting the tech companies dictate that conversation ourselves. And so that naturally tends towards the kind of more utopian view where AI is going to solve all of our problems and create none along the way, whereas actually it might solve a lot of our problems, but it can also create new ones as well. So having a more sensible, grown up, detailed discussion of, well, what is the tolerance of this that we're willing to bear in different areas? And when do we decide that actually it is better to just hand off entire loads of work to an AI system? Is something that we haven't really discussed. And I think it's one that is probably going to come in the next few years as we start to get more comfortable with all of these systems. Worth bearing in mind, we're still in the relatively early stages of this, less than 3 years on from the release of ChatGPT. It's kind of still in the spaghetti being thrown at the wall phase and seeing what exactly sticks in terms of our use cases.
I mean, there's already been tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, you probably know the statistics better than me, of people that have been essentially made jobless as or redundant as a result of AI developments, especially in sort of the tech space and things like that. Have companies then preemptively sort of undercut and gutted their workforces, or are AIs in these sectors actually able to maintain these sort of job losses?
Yeah, in some areas, they are able to, I suppose, supplant human workers. Often, unfortunately, the sorts of things that we're doing in our lives, journalism and that sort of stuff, parts of that can be relatively easily automated by AI. Now, not all of it, because the human conversations that we have are often the key to good journalism, and I think that that is still not going to be able to be replicated by AI systems. But there are areas where you see more impact and more automation than others. Now, in terms of the layoffs, I think that actually what that is companies trying to get ahead of what they think is coming down the line. So we know the International Monetary Fund has said 4 in 10 jobs will be touched or affected in some way, shape, or form by generative AI. That doesn't mean necessarily displaced, by the way, that just means changed, but it is still a significant proportion. And also, they will be more likely to be white collar jobs than blue collar ones. So, this is a kind of new industrial revolution that is infecting people like you and I and those who are watching this rather than perhaps other workers along the way. And I think that they're getting ahead of that to realize that actually they need to recognize there will be a contraction in the workforce and they don't want to be left holding all of these staff when they actually start to find times get a little bit tough. So we're not quite there yet in terms of replacement or augmentation, but I think that we're starting to see businesses making those decisions, looking ahead on their budget lines 4, 5, 6 years down the line.
You answered my last question already, which was going to be, what is your best guess of how far are we from that? But Chris Stokel-Walker, thank you for taking the time.
Thank you.